Hi, everybody. My name's Bill Clerico, and I'm the founder of a venture capital firm called Convective Capital. We are the world's only venture capital firm focused on technologies that can prevent wildfire. I started Convective 3 years ago after a wildfire burned onto our family property, and I just couldn't help but think like technology could play a role in preventing that from ever happening again. And if I could be an investor that could help make those technologies a reality, that was really important and meaningful work. 3 years later, we've raised $35 million. We've invested in 18 companies, and really have tried to help play a role organizing the wildfire community and helping promote innovation and use of technology in wildfire. I put together this talk to talk a little bit about why catastrophic wildfire happens and what we can do about it. Before we plunge into that, we have to acknowledge Los Angeles, obviously the inspiration for this talk, and an enormous tragedy. As of today, January 9th, when I'm recording this, there's 5 active wildfires in Los Angeles, over 29,000 acres burned, 5 confirmed deaths. The preliminary estimates are $20 billion of insured losses and close to $50 billion of total impact. If those numbers end up being confirmed, this will be the most financially damaging wildfire in history, which is quite a staggering and sobering statistic. One of the questions I always get is, are wildfires increasing? The answer to that is sort of. The number of wildfires is actually pretty constant. It's been constant for many years. Obviously, there's cyclicality year to year, but in general, the number of wildfires has stayed relatively constant. What has increased is the number of acres that have burned. You can see, back in the 1990s, an average fire year would burn 2 to 3 million acres, whereas today in the 2020s, we see 10 million acre fire seasons. And so really it's the intensity and scale of wildfires that has increased, not the count or number. And that's why I titled this talk Catastrophic Wildfire, because really what we're talking about here is not just any old wildfire, but how do we stop the really catastrophic large ones, which is a relatively new phenomenon. I think because of this scale, we now really should be thinking of wildfire more like hurricanes. I think we've traditionally thought of wildfire as things that kind of happen out in the woods, things that we can really stop and control. But now they have become so frequent and so severe, we need to think of them as sort of regular disasters and have strategies to manage them, and prevent them, and make significant investments to reduce risk before they ever do happen. Wildfires have been a part of the landscape of forests since the dawn of time. They would naturally burn from lightning. Indigenous people would light fires to manage the landscape, and many species rely on wildfire for reproduction. This historic regime was one of high frequency and low severity. In the early 1990s, with the development of the timber industry, we moved to a policy of maximum suppression. So we started putting out wildfires aggressively, really in the early 1900s, about 100 years ago. And in 1935, the Forest Service rolled out a very famous 10 a.m. policy, which stated that all wildfires should be suppressed by 10 a.m. the next morning. This was actually remarkably effective for a time. It put out wildfires. That was the goal. But what ended up happening was, because it interrupted this natural cycle of burning of the forest became denser and denser. And this sort of natural cycle of high frequency, low severity wildfire was interrupted. And so I really think these pictures are pretty interesting. On the left, you see a picture taken. These 3 pictures were taken in the same location: one in 1923, one in 1947, and one in 2005. And you can just see the density of the landscape increasing from, on the left, sparse trees, open fields, probably used for grazing. In the middle, you can see the forest starting to really populate. And by present day, it's an incredibly dense forest. The landscape on the left, not one that's as vulnerable to high severity wildfire, whereas the one on the right most certainly is. And just to put some numbers behind it, here's measured tree density at 8 sites in the Sierra Nevadas, comparing the end of the 19th century to today. And you can see tree density has just increased significantly. At site number 1, you had less than 100 trees per hectare in the historical data, and today it's well over 300. And so you can see that density has really grown, which adds to the risk for wildfire. This risk has compounded and really changed the fire regime from one of high frequency and low severity to low frequency, high severity. So now when it burns really big with tremendous fuel density. So in my opinion, the primary driver of this wildfire behavior is fuel density and how we've allowed fuel density to grow. But there are exacerbating factors. Certainly, climate change is one of those factors. We've created longer, drier, hotter fire seasons, and longer and hotter and drier fuels. And the way to measure fuel dryness is with a metric called vapor pressure deficit. And you can see how it's just sort of on the rise. This is a measure of how much moisture is emitted from fuels relative to what they can hold. And you can see it's grown really significantly over the last 30 years, which means these fuels are now have a much higher propensity to burn. Not only is there more fuel, but it's much more flammable. We also radically grew the size of the wildland urban interface. Wildland urban interface is the area between cities and the forests. And over the last 30 years, we've built nearly 50% more housing in the WUI, which creates a lot more things in harm's way. Houses are also fuel, and people are sources of ignitions. So these houses are not just vulnerabilities, but they actually can cause wildfire as well, because you have people out mowing the grass and doing what people do. And so this growth of the WUI has really exacerbated the issue as well. A lot of people wonder, is that just California? California is certainly an offender with significant WUI growth, but it's really across the United States. There's been huge growth in the wildland urban interface. We've also let our utility infrastructure age. So, this is the famous Sea Hook that started the 2018 Camp Fire, killed 85 people. PG&E went bankrupt, incinerated the town of Paradise. The age of that hook when it failed was 97 years. So, we really bear a lot of responsibility as a site, and our utilities bear responsibility for maintaining infrastructure and upgrading infrastructure to make sure that it can bear the brunt of high winds and things like that, because when it fails, it can fail extremely catastrophically. And that's a huge source of high damage ignitions. Speaking of ignitions, here's some charts about what starts wildfires and the respective damages. If you look at damages by acres, power lines start about a third of fires, or cause about a third of the acreage damage. Lightning is about a third. And then human-related stuff is about 13%. And then there's some undetermined things, and sort of house fires start the rest. If you look at it in terms of structure damage, power lines are actually closer to 50%. And why is that? Well, power lines are close to houses. And also the same conditions that cause extreme fire behavior, or high winds, also cause power line failure. And so those failures are much more likely to cause both acreage damage, but also structural and human damage. It's important to also point out human-related causes, primarily arson, as a cause of wildfire. There's lots of examples of humans starting really damaging wildfires. Some of it's the campfires, or the chains dragging behind a truck. But some of it too is intentional, where folks actually start fires intentionally to cause damage, and so that's a driver of destruction as well. So what can we do about it? I think it's one thing to admire this problem, but what can we do about it? Forest management. I think this is, going back to fuels, which I think are really the heart of this. Forest management is really the answer to the fuel density. And I really love this graphic. It shows the efficacy of forest management. At the top of the image, you see this is an area that was not treated at all. No prescribed burning, no logging. It just is sort of natural landscape, natural dense landscape. And you can see it was highly charred when a wildfire moved through this area. At the bottom, you see an area that was thinned. It was logged, but there was no prescribed fire. And you can see it survived better than the top part, but still, you can see significant browning and impact. And in the middle, this sort of thinning and prescribed fire stripe, where the landscape was both mechanically thinned and logged, and then prescribed fire was applied to the landscape. That part has fared tremendously well. The fire, as it moved through there, had low severity, didn't kill the trees, and the landscape was able to adapt. And so it's really that middle stripe that I think is where we need to get to have better thinning and prescribed fire to reduce the fuel loads on our landscape. And that will in turn protect towns and cities. So what is stopping us from doing this? There's, again, two parts of forest management: prescribed burning and and mechanical thinning. I'll talk about prescribed burning first. So prescribed burning, it's not a popular thing. People don't love fires burning um, on land next to their houses or businesses or other areas where they spend time. There's smoke from prescribed fire. There's risk of escaped prescribed fire, and so there's really tremendous pushback from communities, both blue and red. Environmental folks push back on it, in addition to agricultural interests and things like that. It's also quite difficult to do. You need a really narrow prescription envelope where the landscape is dry enough for fire to take hold, but not so dry that it's uncontrollable. And so you have to really wait, and the weather's got to be just right, and you have to have the workforce on standby to do the burn. And you got to wait for the weather, so it's challenging to get that right. Permitting's another struggle. One stat I saw recently is the U.S. Forest Service spends 40% of its budget on planning and analysis, which is basically wrangling with these communities, driven largely by NEPA. And that's just a huge amount of time and expense spent planning and permitting projects versus actually doing them. So there's a lot of red tape in doing these projects. It's also just difficult to get insurance for prescribed burning. In a famous case up in Oregon, a local sheriff arrested a U.S. Forest Service employee when a prescribed burn had a minor escape. And so it's there's really significant risk to the people conducting these operations. And it's kind of one of these things, like, if you do it and you're successful, everyone's a little bit annoyed by the prescribed fire. And if you do it and it's not successful, you can cause huge damage. And so there's just very little incentive for people to actually do this work. So switching gears to just mechanical thinning and logging, what stops us from that? One of the big parts that holds us back there is just the wood markets are not as developed as they used to be. Cutting down trees and selling them for timber used to be a pretty established industry on the West Coast, and it's really faded in recent years. Sawmills have closed down, and given the costs of transporting trees, if you don't have local sawmills, it's really not cost effective to do timber operations, and so that's ended up exacerbating the issue, particularly in California, where there just aren't sawmills to process the wood. Permitting again here is really challenging. One of my personal anecdotes. So my wife and I have a property up in Mendocino County. We did some conservation-minded logging there. It took over 2 years to get approval, and we had to hire a contract biologist to come out and call for northern spotted owls 6 times. And I'm all for conservation, but I think we need to have a pretty clear-eyed look at, is that the right use of resources versus the risk reduction that comes with this type of work. There's also some contractual issues. So a lot of offtake agreements or agreements with the U.S. Forest Service end up being 1-year agreements. And so it's very hard to build the infrastructure to do a really big project and process the wood or set up the sawmill if you have short-term agreements. So those are some of the other impediments. What can we do about it? I think reforms to NEPA and permitting can be a really great thing. California recently created a burn boss liability fund to protect burn bosses. And I think technology is another part of this, where companies like BurnBot can actually help prescribe burning happen in a much wider array of conditions. And the wood markets, I think we could work to restore them. And there's some interesting technology out there to actually build smaller wood mills that can be more economically advantaged and more flexible with less investment upfront. And so things like that, I think, could help unlock better fuel treatment. So next, I think after fuel treatment is rapid detection. And there's been some really interesting studies done that say a 15-minute reduction in response time could save billions of dollars a year in California from wildfire suppression costs. Just given that fire grows so exponentially, if you can catch it early, you can have a disproportionate impact on your ability to suppress it. And there's really 2 techniques for early detection. First is satellites. Positive to satellites is they're global, they're ubiquitous, they're kind of always on, and they cover a lot of area. The negatives are they're quite expensive to launch. The resolution, particularly on current satellites, is quite low. And so that means it can't detect a small fire. It has to wait till it kind of lights up the whole pixel, in which case it's sometimes too late. And then because you've got, most of these satellites are in low Earth orbit, they're making passes. And so you get a look, once every so often, and so that results in sort of latency and low refresh times, which makes it hard to get this like instantaneous detection. There are some like classified assets in geosynchronous orbit that have really high resolution detection for that are owned by the U.S. government, but local agencies don't have access to those resources. California set up a program called FireGuard that creates some level of interaction there, but it's far from ideal. The other approach is ground-based cameras. And so a nonprofit called Alert California, originally called Alert Wildfire, started as a project at the University of Reno and in collaboration with UCSD. And they started putting up landscape cameras around the state of California. Now they have over 1,000 cameras across the landscape. And it's a really effective approach because now you can, obviously see wildfire starts, but also have the situational awareness to react really quickly. One of our portfolio companies is a company called Pano, which makes a for-profit version of this and sells this solution to governments, to utilities, ski resorts, all types of different landowners, as one solution to enhance rapid detection. So it's one thing to detect quickly. It's another thing to make sure that you can actually suppress quickly. And there's been a lot of work here to sort of optimize responses, particularly with air resources, in what's called rapid initial attack. A really big success story here is the Southern California Quick Reaction Force, which was the sort of brainchild of a fire chief named Brian Fennessy, who worked to actually put several helicopters on 24/7 standby day and night, so that when a dispatch came in, they could just quickly and aggressively get these resources out to try to nip fires in the bud before they became large. And it's had a lot of success in Southern California stopping early starts. Around the corner is autonomous aircraft and drones. Here's a graph of a hypothetical fire start, and you can see along the bottom is kind of the traditional response. The fire's growing, exponentially. Initially, the curve is quite flat, single-digit acres. But by the time you actually locate the fire, you do a size up, you order resources, they get there, and those resources get on scene and actually conduct suppression operations, the fire can be quite large depending on conditions. Whereas if you had pre-positioned autonomous aircraft, those aircraft could detect an ignition, fly immediately there, and start suppression operations with a lot less time, which means the fire is significantly smaller than what it would be otherwise. And so I think this has a lot of promise as a technique. Home hardening is another important technique. Here on the right is a picture of the famous Lahaina Miracle House, which was the one house that survived the wildfires in Lahaina this year. There are some well-established techniques that harden homes. Fire-resistant materials, particularly roofing, double pane windows, landscaping appropriately so that wildfire can't actually get to the house. Houses don't just ignite; they need to have sort of ladder fuels that build up to the house and ultimately burn the house down. So there's a number of techniques that can be done to harden houses against wildfire, but and can be successful. I think this is obviously an anecdote, but speaks to what's possible. There's also hardening at the community level. Once fire starts spreading house to house, it's actually quite hard to just harden the individual homes, and so the community needs to be hardened as well. Doing fuel treatment, fire breaks, water supplies, building code ordinances, zoning, evacuation planning. All this happens at the community level to kind of harden the community for wildfire. There's a program called FireWise Communities that helps communities walk through some of these programs. One of our portfolio companies called Fireside. They build software for fire departments and communities to do defensible space inspections around homes. Traditionally, a firefighter might show up at your house and write some notes on a clipboard and give you a piece of paper. Fireside helps transform that into a digital experience where they're documenting what deficiencies exist on the home, what could be improved. The homeowner can capture when they've actually done the work. And so this is really useful because it actually drives better resident behavior and compliance with some of these ordinances around defensible space. Utilities. So utilities, they cause a surprising amount of the damage, and they spend billions of dollars every year on wildfire risk mitigation. One of the big categories of spend for them is vegetation management. As an aside, PG&E spends over $1 billion annually trimming trees around power lines. I've heard Patty Pop jokingly call them. Patty's the CEO. the Pacific Gas, Electric, and Tree Trimming Company. It's just such a huge part of what they do. And there's a huge industry of contractors that do this work. One of the largest private companies in the United States is called Asplund. All they do is utility tree trimming, just to give you a sense of the sort of the scale of this work. Technology can improve this. So we have an investment in a company called Overstory. Overstory, uses satellite imagery to analyze trees around power lines and identify high-risk trees that might be unhealthy or encroaching on lines to prioritize some of this work. So you don't have to do manual patrols and manual inspections. It can be done via satellite. Another approach is the ESPS and PSPS, which is the Enhanced Safety Power Shutoff and the Public Safety Power Shutoffs. What this means is basically utilities de-energizing lines in advance of high-risk conditions. It's hugely unpopular. People don't like their power shut off, particularly when there's high wind events, but very effective. It reduces the risk of ignition really significantly. Enhanced safety power shutoffs refer to utilities reconfiguring their breaker settings on circuits so that if there's a vegetation strike or a short, circuits can be just rapidly de-energized. And before they can put enough energy into a tree to start a fire. And so that I think is another promising technique, but also results in more outages because you get more false alarms. One of our portfolio companies, Gridware, can help lessen the impact of that. They build sensors for power poles so that when there are vegetation strikes on lines, the utility knows exactly where it happened. And, they don't know if something happens to some random pole out there. But with Gridware, they actually have insight into their network and can, sense the vibrations or the acoustic impact of that fall. Undergrounding is another technique. PG&E is committed to 10,000 miles of undergrounding, but it's incredibly expensive. It's costs $3 to $4 million per mile to underground electric lines, and so it can only really be done in certain locations. It's also quite slow. Despite that commitment, PG&E I think has only really undergrounded hundreds of miles of lines so far to date, and so there's still a ways to go to do this, and it's not a panacea. Insurance. A lot of folks talk about insurance, and certainly that needs to be a part of protecting communities. But we've seen a lot about the insurance market in California, being on the cusp of failure, and certainly this event in LA is not going to help things. Here's a chart of FAIR Plan policy. So if the FAIR Plan in California is the insurer of last resort, it's a subsidized insurance policy that's required by the state to be offered. And you can see just as people have gotten kicked off their traditional homeowners policies, they've had to flock to this program, and it's grown a tremendous amount, over the last couple of years. Fire tech. I've touched on this in a couple of different places across the talk, but really we think technology can play a role across the spectrum. The first place it can play a role is in the preparation and prevention stage, where technology can help de-risk wildfire before it ever starts by mapping, forecasting different types of physical resilience. Next is the response phase. Technologies that can address wildfires as they occur, detection, situational awareness, suppression. This is where things like autonomous aircraft, I think, can play a really big role. Recovery. So what happens to communities after they recover? And how do you make sure that there's insurance that can be priced appropriately, that you can get reforestation, that construction is done well. And meanwhile, you've got enabling technologies under the hood, things like remote connectivity, geospatial tools that can be used in all these different types of applications. I get a lot of questions about how big fire tech is. We've sort of meticulously combed the market. We've identified about 600 fire tech companies over the years. We've broken them down into these stages. The vast majority of activity is in preparation and response. I actually think there's a huge opportunity in recovery as these disasters become more and more common. These communities will need the tools to repair, and I think technology companies can play a role in that. What can you do? A couple things that I'll just suggest here. One, download Watch Duty. It's a free app. It's situational awareness. There's a team of volunteers that listen to radio scanners and pull in a bunch of data and information so that you can look at an app and really understand what's going on. It's a great safety tool. If you feel inclined, you can donate as well because it's a nonprofit that they build this. Megafire Action is a 501c3 that works to, and a 501c4 that works to advocate for better wildfire policy around things like prescribed burning. And so if you're inclined, you could give to them as well to change some of these long-term policies. Wildfires.org is another great nonprofit organization. They build software for the U.S. Forest Service to help automate NEPA applications. And so really is another way to sort of unlock some of this fuel treatment, fuel management. You can also apply to attend our Red Sky Summit. If you're really interested in building a company in this space or in joining a company in this space, we host an annual event called the Red Sky Summit where we bring together, fire chiefs, founders, utilities, insurance companies, for a bunch of conversations about wildfire and how we can do better. And so that'll be coming up in November, and you can go to our website to apply. I'd also mention that you can work in fire tech. So we have 18 companies in our portfolio at this point. There's a jobs board on our website, and there's tons of openings. So if you're thinking about making a career change or job change, and you might want to work on this as your full-time gig, there's lots of ways to have a really big impact on this problem at one of these companies. And with that, that's kind of the talk. I want to just give some thanks to Nat Friedman and Patrick Carlson, who gave me the idea to pull this talk together. The Convective Capital team, who, on short notice, pulled together a bunch of resources to make this happen. Our portfolio companies, from which I've learned a ton, and especially Rain, Overstory, and Pano, who contributed resources and data to this presentation. Our advisor, Michael Wara, at the Woods Institute at Stanford, he does an annual talk at the Red Sky Summit called "The State of Wildfire," and we borrowed heavily from that talk for this presentation. Our investors at Convective Capital that enable us to do the work that we do, and just many other folks in this ecosystem who've been generous with their time and knowledge in helping me get up to speed. So with that, I hope you took something away from this that you can apply or learn something valuable. And really, I think it takes collective action from all of us to have an impact on this problem, and it's not going away anytime soon. I think until we really can change the society and embrace some of these potential solutions, we're unfortunately going to see more of these disasters. And so I look forward to a future where that's not the case.